Does not that hurts your brain, doesn't it? Kind of hurts your brain. The topic today is what I like to refer to as cognitive illusions. Sometimes we refer to we have these things called optical illusions. We have these things called cognitive biases. I just kind of put those two things together and called it cognitive illusions because we really don't. The interesting thing is we really don't see reality or objective reality, what exists outside of our senses. We don't see it 100% correctly. It's not like it's completely false or something. It's not completely
Hang on.
it's not completely 100% correct. But anyways, this is an optical illusion. I love optical illusions. I always tell the story. There's the exploratorium down in San Francisco, down on Fisherman's Wharf, or not on the wharf, but on the Embarcadero. And I love going there. And I went there one time, and they have a bookstore in there, and they had a book on optical illusions. And I was just, I should have bought it, but I was just leafing through each of the pages, and it was just very interesting and exciting for me. And then they had to eventually just kick me out, so I should have probably just bought the book. Um, I love them. I don't know why. I've always been attracted to them. I think they're pretty neat. I think it's pretty neat how our brain works, and I think it's pretty neat that our brain doesn't really work the way we think our brain works for the most part. I'm not saying you. I'm saying people in general. You might know exactly how the brain works. If you do, give me a call. Um, these things obviously aren't moving, but we can't. The thing about it is we all see it pretty much the same. I mean, there may be some special people out there who don't see these things look like they're moving, but they look like they're moving. But we know they're not, right? There's a part of your brain says they're moving. There's a part of your brain says, nope, they're not. It's kind of like this class. There's a part of your brain says, hey, waterfall seems like it should work. No, not really. Here's some other ones. And these are some of the more famous ones. Obviously, a lot of them deal with size, because one of the things that we have, which is even a bias, is we have this bias of proportionality or comparing things. We're not really good with what I would consider objective size. It's just one of our human frailties. We're good with relative size, which is one of the reasons why on day two, we go all the way back to day two, we use relative size to measure the stories, the effort, and the value, because we're so much better at that. And it's so much quicker. Because if you look at this, you see, an orange circle surrounded by big circles, and then you see an orange circle surrounded by small circles, and the orange circle is the same size, but it doesn't look the same size. Right? Because our brains were built for relativity, not for absolutes. The ones that I think are some of the most magnificent and amazing ones are the ones that deal with shades, coloring, because we're again, our brain was built to see things based on relativity and other things and certain expectations. So it's very hard to believe this, but the shading of B is exactly the same as A. But obviously they don't look the same. And the reason being is we expect something in the shade, right, to be darker. And we see it looks like there's a shading here. Sizing, the way we look at things, our perspective of things, right? This table, and you can Google any of these and you can see it. Table, if you move it like this, it's exactly the same size. Perhaps the most famous of all optical illusions, probably the first one I ever saw, and the first one a lot of people see, is down here in the bottom right-hand corner. Again, perspective. A and B are the same length, but our brain doesn't see it that way. Now, here's the interesting thing about these optical illusions, these cognitive illusions, all these things I'm going to talk about today. We have a way of confirming or disconfirming, else we would have never found them in the first place. And the way we do that is what I would consider math or science. We have ways of trying to get to the truth. In science, we can't always get to the truth, but we can get to something that has a preponderance of evidence, and sometimes that's close enough to the truth that we can use that as a way to operate in the world and be successful or be optimal. So you can take out a ruler. All you gotta do is take out a ruler and measure the length of line A and measure the length of line B, and you can see that they're the same length. like, by the ruler, but you can't see it with your eyes, right? That's why they're illusions. This is one I ran into the other day. I thought was pretty interesting. I was just looking around the internet, and somebody sent this. Again, I think the point I'm trying to make is all of this, all of quote unquote objective reality, a lot of times is merely our perception of reality. And it's not always right. It's not always accurate. Here's the thing. When we look at these optical illusions, right? This is our sight in our brain. And I think you all know this, most of you know this, that when you look at the number of neurons in your brain that are dedicated to seeing things, it's a huge percent. I forget what the percentage is. I'm going to say it's about 70%. I'm sure somebody will look it up and they'll correct me in chat, right? But it's a huge amount. This is our best sense, is sight, right? Because it's really good. I mean, who would want to use echolocation, right? If you could see, you don't want to do that. In fact, bats don't use just echolocation; they have pretty good sight, but that's another thing. If we make mistakes in vision, this is from Dan Ariely, one of my favorite people. He's in behavioral economics. He studies these things. What are the he has this book, Predictably Irrational. What are these things that we do that are irrational, that just don't really make sense, that are not optimal? If we make these mistakes in our best sense, what happens when we move into the world of complexity? Right? And it's his words. He is, what happens when it's more complex? Places where we don't have a lot of practice, places where we didn't evolve for. We didn't evolve for, financial services or whatever else, a lot of the stuff in healthcare and science and blah, blah, blah. What happens when we get into these domains such as decision making and economic reasoning? What happens? Well, he'll tell you we behave irrationally. And wonderful books, by the way. And when we go back to Peter Senge, right? He talks about, we don't perceive the world we see the world that we perceive, that our senses allow us to see. We don't see things as they are. We see things as we are, right? And that's a tough one, because we have all these wonderful sayings like seeing is believing, right? And we put a lot of stock in eyewitness testimony, right? But we know through science and DNA that we get that wrong all the time, whether people are doing it on purpose or they just don't, they're not. Because I think sometimes they're doing it on purpose, but sometimes they just are mistaken. And we're very often mistaken. And the hard part is if we're this easily fooled by this, what happens when we get into something that's complex like software development? How often do we fool ourselves? And I think it's pretty often. Let me tell you a story. I like telling stories. I'll tell you the story. This is from Christian Times newspaper, September 30th, 2016. Randall Prince was an electrical worker, and he found these ballot boxes in a backroom warehouse in Columbus, Ohio, which is no surprise to me because I grew up in Ohio. So there's some shady things going on in Columbus. This story, by the way, was shared with 6 million people. This was during the presidential election, the one before the last one, right? 6 million people shared it among themselves, probably on Facebook or somewhere, Twitter, whatever. Here's the problem, though. It's not real. It was completely made up. We know this because there's a guy named Cameron Harris. Everybody knows Cameron. He's not a nice guy. It's called clickbait. He knew that people would react to this. He knew that it would get a rise out of people. He knew people would believe this because why? Because they wanted to believe it. They wanted to believe it. Why did people do it? Because they wanted to believe it. It's called confirmation bias. People want to believe that certain things are true. So they will look for evidence of the truth of that truth. And if not, and that's how we can manipulate people. We can manufacture things just like this person did. We have the same in job interviews. A lot of you folks looking for jobs, right? So we call gambler's fallacy. If you're not familiar with gambler's fallacy, I did a lot of independent study on prognostication at my own expense in Las Vegas. I got my PhD and then some. It was at great expense, but I did that for the good of the whole. What happens is we contrast and we look at what happens in this relativity thing, not objective facts. So gambler's fallacy is if you're playing roulette and it comes up red 10 times in a row, then it must need to come up black, or I guess there's a little green thing that always messes you up. It must come up black the next time, right? Because it's as if odds have some kind of memory. They don't. The odds of it coming up, if you have flipping a coin, if you get 10 heads in a row, the odds of it coming up heads or tails on the next flip is 50-50, always, every flip. But we do that. So this happens in job interviews. So if there a lot of companies these days will do back-to-back interviews or 3 or 4 interviews in a row or all day session kind of thing. Have you ever done those? Man, that's grueling. I did it one time. I think I interviewed eight times. It was like 1 hour after an hour. It's like a whole day. And I didn't get the job. I should have sent him a bill. It's crazy. Anyway, if the candidates in front of you are weak, you're going to appear stronger. And if the candidates in front of you are strong, you're going to appear weaker. That's part of the gambler's fallacy, that we have this streak of bad people, so we must have good people show up afterwards. And they did a study on it. And the study is that interviewers will add the equivalent of 2 years of job experience to the last candidate in a row when those in front of them are weak. Gambler's fallacy. That's the reason I want to bring that up, that particular one. It also happens, by the way, in other things. Let me go back. Judicial rulings. So if you're going to be on trial, and a lot of times, I don't know how many people have been able to experience the judicial system, but those who might have been on juries or something like that, a lot of times they'll do multiple tries. They don't usually last. It's not like Law and Order or anything. They usually don't last very long. If the 3 people in front of you are guilty, then the chances of you being innocent actually go up, regardless of the objective facts. Loan applications, if the people in front of you have poor credit and then you show up, then you're going to look better. And if the people in front of you have good credit, your credit's going to look worse. Very human. It happens that way. Baseball games, balls and strikes. How do they know this? They run statistical studies and say, look, the chances of this happening by chance alone is so slim that we believe that there's something else going on here. Job interviews, overconfidence effect. Here's another one, right? We are very confident of our own abilities, almost to the point of what they would call being overconfident. This happens a lot of job interviews. I remember I gave this talk to a place I was working before. And my boss said, I love that talk that you gave. And especially this thing that you talked about with, job interviews, with people thinking that they can somehow, ask the perfect question and figure out the perfect candidate. But I'm better than the rest of them. I'm good at that. I'm like, well, this is the whole point of what I was trying to say. You're like the walking overconfidence effect here. Job interviews, unstructured job interviews, are a poor predictor of how people will actually perform on the job. They do something in statistics. I'm not a huge statistics person. I skim by it. I do the best I can with it. It's called an R correlation value. The R correlation value is about the same as chance when you do job interviews. I used to work with somebody when I was very young, who told me, he was an old guy. He was semi-retired, but he still liked to work. I'd never understood that, but and he told me he had worked at some place. He says, it's a crapshoot when you hire somebody. He says the thing you should do is hire somebody if you need somebody, and if it doesn't work out, make sure that you kind of figure out what to do with them pretty quickly. Don't let them stay. because the ones that I thought would do well didn't do so well, and the ones that, because I had to hire, and then the ones I thought was really great didn't turn out. It says you never know. You can't do it by a 1 hour job interview. I mean, jobs are kind of like marriage, right? When you marry somebody, you don't go out for dinner for an hour and say, hey, let's get married. So some of us know, right? You still spend a little extra time with them just in case. And if it were even after all the time that we spend with somebody, if it were that accurate, divorce rates wouldn't be as high as they are, right? I mean, we do make mistakes. What's the best way to predict how somebody's going to work on the job? Put them on the job. Apprenticeships, internships. That's the key, by the way. That's what I keep preaching. So, well, someday somebody hear me. Someday somebody with some money and influence will hear me. I know you all hear me. I'm not saying you don't. If you have money and influence, let me know. I don't. So assess how they're going to do. That's the best way to do it. You know, there are no right answers or wrong answers. And some of these tests that they used to do, why are manhole covers round and all that, you know, happy nonsense, has no indication how somebody's going to do on the job. I always tell the story about I knew somebody at Amazon. He was a manager there. He says, oh, I've come up with a perfect way to interview candidates, and it had to do with whiteboards and all kinds of stuff. And I've been very successful with it. And it was about the only time I really got an argument over the internet kind of thing, you know, because that doesn't really make any sense. But you have no idea. You work at Amazon. You know, this is a place people want to work. We're not talking about the warehouse workers. We're talking about the, you know, programmers and things like that. So this is a place people want to work. I said, take your system that you find foolproof, take it down to the DMV, see how that helps. See how many good developers you hire through your system, right? Probably not the same. There is no universal way to interview people. Overconfidence effect. We're very confident. Anyway, I beat that one. That one's dead. I have this poster, believe it or not. There's a poster, you could buy it. It wasn't cheap either, and it's just printed on paper. But John Magnugian III and Buster Benson, I want to give credit where credit is due. They came up with this thing. This is from 2016. It's called the Cognitive Bias Codex. Got a nice picture of brain in the middle. And coming off of the brain, you see these leaves, I suppose you could call them. Each one of those small little things, this is not an eye test. You don't have to read it. Those are cognitive biases that the human brain is susceptible to. There are about 170, I believe, that have been identified. If you go to Wikipedia and you type in Google list of cognitive biases, I believe it's over 170 now that science has found. Some of them are very similar. So what they did is they grouped them into particular groups, which is the, I don't know, 20 or so that you will see on the outside. And then they took those 20 or so and put them into 4 major groups, which is kind of nice. Kind of an interesting taxonomy. I just learned that word the other day, so I'm going to use it. Taxonomy. Interesting taxonomy of cognitive biases, right? So we're going to talk about the major groups of cognitive biases and a few of them. This should be a sobering thing. It is for me, because when you look at this and you say, oh my gosh, I used to think, you know, my senses were pretty good, or my thinking was pretty good, but I am susceptible to all of these different problems. What is a cognitive bias? Let's get into the dictionary definition. Systematic pattern or deviation from the norm or rationality and judgment whereby inferences about other people and situations may be drawn in an illogical fashion. Individuals create their own subjective social reality from their perception of the input. We have a ton of input coming to us all the time, by the way. So there's a lot of things that we need to do in order to deal with that input. And a lot of times we take shortcuts, which we call heuristics, rules of thumb, you might call, that are close, and sometimes close enough is good enough, but not always. Remember, I want to go back to the argument that I said before, Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. Why is it that Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger are billionaires and the rest of us aren't? Well, part of it's luck, but the other part is they get a 1 or 2% higher return on their investment than others do, right? So 1 or 2% better is sometimes all it takes, and especially in the complex world where we have these asymmetric payoffs. right? So if we're deviating from reality, most of the time it's good enough. In the physical world, it's probably good enough. In the complicated world, it's probably good enough. In the complex world, not necessarily good enough, especially if your competition knows what we now know, right? And we have to use these things, because if not, we'd all just be, comatose all the time. We'd be like, the schizophrenics. What do they call them? They just sit there. You don't move, right? Because you just be overwhelmed by your senses all the time. So your brain takes shortcuts. Most of the time, we're not aware of the shortcuts that our brain takes. But now we're, through science and brain study and behavioral economics, sociology, and other studies that have been done, we realize, look, we're just not as good as we think we are at these things. We fooled ourselves for some time. Now we know better. Good. That's a good thing. But if we tried to spend all our time analyzing everything that came into our senses, we'd be in trouble. So we have to rely on shortcuts at certain times, but there are certain times where these shortcuts don't help us. So we should know what the shortcuts are, and we should know how our brain works so that we can guard ourselves against it, right? So one of the main categories that Magnugian and Benson came up with is we have too much information all the time. So we have to pick and choose from the information that's coming to us, and we don't get it all. And we cut corners. And one of the ways we cut corners, which is one of the most insidious ones. In fact, I was on a podcast, Sarah, I don't know if Sarah's on this morning. She said, I love to talk about the biases, what's probably the worst, the most important one to understand. I'd say confirmation bias. We don't look for things. We're not looking for the truth. We're looking to be right. We're not looking for what is right. We make a decision on what we think is right, and then we look for evidence that confirms it. We tend to accept information that confirms our prior beliefs and ignore or discredit information that doesn't. And this is not necessarily a good thing. Here's some other things that we do. These are the other categories. We notice things that are often primed in memory or repeated. So I'll always, if you buy a new car, whatever it is you buy, you're going to see that car on the road more. You're going to notice it more, usually, right? So if you buy a Prius, you're going to notice, oh, well, look at all those Priuses. Of course, I drove a Saturn, so anytime I saw a Saturn, that was a cause for celebration, but that's a different story. Things that are bizarre, things that are different, funny, visually striking, anthropomorphic things, they stick out. We see this, actually. I was talking to my son the other day. And we were talking about, things like Instagram and Facebook and kids these days. I'm not him particularly, but kids who use social media too much. They just have to keep doing more and more bizarre things because you can't rise up the crowd. I mean, it's kind of like, when your kids do a cartwheel and they say, "Look at me, Mom, look at me." Everybody's out there on Instagram doing cartwheels. So now they started they were eating Tide Pods for a while. They were dumping cold water over their heads or something. They just got to do more to get attention. And I feel sorry for them that they need this attention so badly, right? We got to be more and more bizarre. That's part of the problem. And that's part of the media. I don't want to come down on the media. There's so many people who come down on the media, but that's one of the problems of the media, right? Dog bites man, no problem. Man bites dog, it's news. These are the things this is just something that we're built for as human beings, is we notice things that are different. We don't notice things that are the same. It's why I try to be funny. Doesn't always work, but I try to be. We notice when things have changed more than when they stay the same. This is a real problem. As I go through all of these, I think I always mention in the class, think about global warming as a problem, because it really falls into the gaps of our thinking. Because we notice when things are changed, right? So now that it's really hot out there, we're all going to talk about global warming. When it cools down, we're going to stop talking about it, right? Because that's how we're built as human beings. I have this bizarre thing where I notice when when trees change, right? If I go back to my hometown in Cincinnati where I grew up, little place called Finneytown, and I go back to the street I grew up on, I can see, I'll notice that. Look, the workers chop their tree down. I notice when the trees are gone. I don't know why. It's just, I'm a strange person. We're drawn to things that confirm our own beliefs, right? Talked about that. That's a bad one. we notice flaws in others more easily than ourselves. We have this thing, it's called attribution error, where if I'm late, I'll give you 100 reasons why I'm late. My kid was sick, too much traffic, et cetera, et cetera. Somebody else is late. Oh, that lazy, no good, blah, blah, blah. It's attribution error, right? It's hard for us to put ourselves in other people's things. This is so bad. I told you I'd come up with this quote from Max Planck, a scientist. He says, a scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it. This is not the only time I've seen it. I was just on the only social media I use is LinkedIn because it's supposed to be about business. But anyway, a good friend of mine, Kyle Griffin, he posted something similar to this about organizational change. Organizations change by are generational changes, meaning that, you know, the reason that we can now move into remote learning and remote work is because, you know, my generation, the generation that didn't have it, is dying off, so to speak, in the workplace, and the new generation is embracing it. There's a colloquial expression of this, which is science advances one funeral at a time. And the interesting thing about this is we're talking about scientists. These are people who should know better. I mean, this is where Senge says, if Max Planck and his crowd have trouble with this, you know, how do you expect us mere mortals to behave? Because that's what we do. And we have to guard against this confirmation bias of always looking for things that tell us we're right because we like being right. It gives us a nice little hit of dopamine, right? The next category, we don't have enough meetings. So we either have too much information, or the information we have is spotty or not complete. One of the big ones on this is survivorship bias. This is the one where, you know, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and whoever else dropped out of college. So, you know, therefore we're going to read books and they're going to talk about how they dropped out of college and did blah, blah, blah. And we should all just do the same thing because that's how you become rich. That's survivorship bias. What most people don't realize is the amount of luck that goes into any of these people making the money that they make. If anything was off, any one of those things, it's not just one thing, but any one thing was off, they wouldn't have been who they are. I mean, in terms of even knowing who they are. That's the thing that we don't see, right? We don't see all the people who did exactly what they did, but didn't make $1 million because they didn't write a book, because nobody's going to read it, right? Nobody's going to read a book. How I became a menial worker in 100 days or less. Nobody is not a book there. So that's survivorship bias. I think you all get that. There's times when we don't have enough meaning, we create stories, because human beings are really good at stories. This is another thing that's really, really interesting. And you see it if you've ever seen a State of the Union address, where the president comes in and he gives his address to the joint session of Congress. He'll always have people in the crowd, and he'll tell a story. He or someday, hopefully someday she, will tell a story about these people. Because when we tell stories, one is that's how we learn things. So we can easily imagine we sat around the campfire and told stories when we were our brains were forming. The other is that we respond to it. We don't respond to big numbers. So I think it's, if one person dies, it's a tragedy. If 1 million people die, it's a statistic. We're not good with those things. So we want to find stories. And we do, right? We see somebody homeless on the street, and we come up with a whole story about how they didn't pay attention in high school or something, right? We know their whole history now. We fill in characteristic stereotypes. We put people in groups. You're in my group, you're not in my group. And we make all kinds of stories about that. People that we're familiar with or fond with, we see those as actually better, smarter. Right? Again, this is the in group versus out group status. We're very tribal. We think we know what others are thinking. We ascribe motives to people. I don't think any of you, hopefully none of you can read thoughts, because nobody wants to be your friend anyway, if you could, right? I don't want people to know what I'm thinking all the time. But we think we know what others are thinking. We don't. Again, we ascribe motives and say, oh yeah, well, this, blah, blah, blah. It's not true. And again, going back to the global warming thing, we project our current mindset and assumptions onto the past and the future. We think that everything's going to be in the future pretty much as it is today. But it does change. And something like global warming does change it, but it changes it so slowly. It's like the frog in water, which I don't think is true, or whatever, you put a frog in a pot and you just turn up the degree at a time and it will boil. It won't get out of the water. I don't think that's true, but I think eventually the frog will get out of the water. There's a whole bunch of different things like that. And then, sometimes we just need to act fast. We don't have the time. So when we do that, we create slides, and it says right up here, we need to act fact. Spell check didn't find it for me. And the very first time I presented it, and I've left it that way because, yeah, sometimes we act too fast because we just don't have the time to think things through. One of the things that they put in this category is called Dunning-Kruger effect, which is probably one of my favorite of the biases, being an Agile coach. And I'd like to think after, a dozen years or so that I'm close to being an expert at this. But Dunning-Kruger is a bias where people of low ability believe that their ability is greater than it is. This is what your mother used to tell you: a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, right? And I was, again, in LinkedIn just the other day, there was some kind of graph that they were showing about cognitive biases and Dunning-Kruger. People who don't have as much information don't know the depth of the domain and how big it is. So they think they know everything. An expert who studied it will say, oh my gosh, there's so much more to this. And they won't be as confident in anything they say. A good consultant, whether they're trained to say this or whether they actually believe it, will say, when asked a question, will say, it depends. Right? And that's why I don't even come into the point where I tell people what to do when I'm being, that's not what I don't think a consultant should do. What I will do is I'll say, here's what I'm thinking. Here's what I'm seeing. The farthest I'll go is, here's what I would do if I'm you. If I were in your shoes, here's what I would do. But it's always based on, this is what I know now. This is what I'm thinking. This is what I'm seeing. If any of that is wrong, what I'm telling you I would do would change. So let's get to the truth of what's going on first, and then figure it out together, right? Because I can't be you, and I'm certainly not in your shoes. When we need to act fast, they put some of the things under this category is we need to be confident in our ability to make an impact and feel like what we do is important. I always tell my kids, and I think I've said this before in class, that we're all the stars of our own movie. Right? We got this little movie we're playing in our heads. The reality that we created, we're the star. Everything that happens to us, it's really important, even if it's not. And everybody else, you're just bit players. Some of you got walk-on roles. Some of you are co-stars, but hey, I'm the star of my own show. And so everything I do has this huge importance, but it's not true. I tell my son, my youngest boy, I said, what's the biggest zit in the world? It's the one on your own head. It's the one on your own face. But the problem is and this is part of getting older, is you realize that everybody else is wrapped up in their own world and they're not thinking that much about you. And that's okay. There's a certain freedom to not having to worry about what people think about you because they're too busy thinking about themselves. And that's all right. We tend to favor things that are immediate, relatable, over delayed and distance. Again, the example of one, this is a big problem in behavioral economics because of people and saving money, planning for the future. The famous marshmallow experiment, with kids. This is a problem with global warming. Can we say, hey, look, in order to have a better future, we're gonna pay a little bit more money up front, because the problem is we haven't been paying it as we went. We just assumed that polluting was free, that there were no consequences, and now we've got a kind of a technical debt of pollution, for lack of a word. Here's a big one in project management and product management. We're motivated to complete things we've already invested time and energy in. This is sunk cost fallacy. The only thing you should be looking at in an investment is from today forward. Do I expect a greater return on my investment going forward than I am going to invest going forward? If the answer is no, you should stop doing it. Again, I learned this the hard way in the PhD of probability that's called Las Vegas. We're motivated to preserve our autonomy and status in a group and to avoid irreversible decisions. Again, this is problematic when you have a slow-moving problem like climate change. Can we make the big, bold changes that are necessary? We're not good at that. We don't like to make those decisions. And you see a lot of these in politics, which is one of the reasons I got political earlier. So I think you all know that my heart's in the right place, even though if you don't agree with my opinions of politics. We favor options that appear simple or that have more complete information over more complex and ambiguous options. This is a problem with leadership in general. We are, as human beings, attracted to leaders that have simple solutions to complex problems. But we know now that there's not always simple solutions to complex problems. So if you want to be a good politician, we've seen we've seen the script, right? You just need a 3-word catchphrase. Lock her up, build a wall, blah, 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 blah. If you go more than that and you try to have a nuanced conversation about, the way things are, that doesn't play well in the press. There's not many nuanced conversations. Personally, I think the person who would have been the best president of the United States and still maybe someday would be is Elizabeth Warren. She had a plan for everything. She has what I would consider a nuanced understanding of reality, more so than the rest of them. She didn't get that far. I mean, she got pretty far, but she didn't get that far. Again, my opinion. Your mileage may vary. Last main column. We have problems with what we remember. So we act fast. We don't have enough information. We kind of makes up information as we go, et cetera, et cetera. And then sometimes we remember the things wrong. We assume that our brains are again, I'll go back to Senge, like that camera. They're not. We recreate the past, sometimes whole cloth. The story of satanic worship is a cautionary tale. It was a big deal. I don't know if you're all old enough to remember this. Some of you are. There were people who went to jail on flimsy evidence, and it was kids basically saying, "Oh yeah, they were taking our blood and torturing us and doing all these things," right? Because what happened is that they were able to implant memories into people. Our memories aren't as clean as we like them to be. We are easily suggestible. It could be as simple as, and I tell the story about there's a Brain Games is a show that used to be on Netflix. I think it's back. It was better before. They got a new host. I don't like it as much, but they did a very simple experiment. They changed one word in how they described it. They staged an accident and they changed one word, right? So the people saw an accident in front of them and they said, "How fast was the car going when it crashed into the other one?" And then they phrase it to a different group. "How fast was the car going when it bumped into the other one?" And that changed just in the way they worded the question, which is in politics called push polling, by the way. The way they changed the question changed the way people remembered the accident, right? So our memories are not what we think they are. We edit and reinforce some things after the fact. We discard specifics to form generalities because we don't remember all the specifics, but we can remember general things. And we just reduce things to key elements. We store things differently based on how they were experienced. One of the tricks that you should have learned hopefully in school is when you're taking a test, you want to have the test environment be as close to the environment that you had when you were studying. So if you could, if you're smart, go into a classroom and study in a classroom, because you're going to, your memories are going to change based on how you experience them. So 170 plus cognitive biases, illusions, ways that we don't see the world 100% clearly. These things can have some real problems, right? We know this. Doesn't always happen that way. So it's not whether this is a good or a bad thing, right? It's whether we're optimal in the world that we're in. There's a movie called Everest, which was released in 2015. Some of you might have seen it. 5 experienced climbers died in May 1996. This is a tragedy too, by the way, on Everest. Is there's so many people who are hiking now. It's a big thing that everybody wants to hike Everest so they can take a picture, they can take a selfie and send it around the world because that means something. They mark the trails with the dead bodies because it's so cold up there that the bodies don't decompose. So it's like, I don't want to be flippant about this, but I can just imagine them saying, okay, we're going to take a left at Frank, and then, bad joke. Sorry about that. It was so bad that Michael Roberto in the California Management Review Journal, which I never miss a copy of, one of my favorites, wrote a piece on it. Interactions of cognitive biases, psychological safety, and system complexity. Some of my favorite words, by the way. He said that there was a bunch of biases that came together in this perfect storm of biases that caused this problem. What were they? Sunk cost effect. Well, it's very expensive. We've made it this far. We should keep going. We've already invested this. Instead of looking at it and saying, well, who cares if you made it this far? The odds of you making it to the top are a lot slimmer now than they were when you started. Overconfidence effect. We've done it before. These are all experienced people who've been to the top before. I think every single one of them. Recency effect. Being at that time, well, nobody's died on the Hill lately, right? All of these things and others went into their calculation of continuing on when they shouldn't, and most people wouldn't. Other examples: global financial crisis, 2007, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl. Here's a couple others. The Chernobyl is, by the way, if you get a chance, it's a great show on HBO. I don't usually push something. That was such an awesome mini series, and I like to mention most of you know Jana is from Kazakhstan. One of her cousins was one of the first responders to Chernobyl and died shortly after from the effects of radiation poisoning. I had a note in here. I usually don't read my notes, but this subject of biases is so important, and learning how to recognize our biases and not have them injected into our thinking and operating in the real world. That you might be familiar with DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Authority. DARPA, they helped to invent the internet. They have an offshoot called IARPA, which is the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects activity. They study these things. In fact, I don't do it anymore, but they had some videos, and I've never, tried to get anything through like Freedom of Information Act or something like that. But they had these videos that I was very curious about, and I couldn't see them all because it was done for, I don't know, the CIA or FBI or something. And I ended up having write to a lieutenant general or something like that and said, do you mind if I use your videos for some training I have? And she was very nice and responded immediately. So it was pretty cool, because usually interacting with the government and bureaucracy is not fun. This is a big deal for the CIA, because most of the CIA, they're analysts. They're trying to predict the future. So if they don't have a accurate version of what the truth is or what reality is, or if they're influenced by their biases, they're going to not give the best advice. They're not going to make great predictions. So it's important. So what do we do? Right? I was always told when I was younger, you probably heard the same thing. If you go to your boss with a problem, you should go with a solution. So we got a problem here. We got all these biases, all these ways of clouding our thinking. And as we learn about them, one of the main things is let's learn about them. Let's stop assuming that our brains do what we think they do because science keeps telling us again and again and again that it doesn't work the way we think it works. And if you had any machine that didn't work the way you thought it worked, you're probably in for trouble somewhere along the line. So let's think about our operating system here, our brain, and say, look, our operating system isn't working the way we thought it was working. There's not really one brain. That's part of the problem. We assume that we have one brain. We don't. We have a series of brain systems. Here comes that word system again, that operate relatively independent of each other. Because we had different brain systems evolved for different things at different points of human evolution. We can see that in just how the brain is structured, right? You have the frontal cortex and cerebrum up top, you have your brain stem, you have your hypothalamus and all these, other things going on in the middle, your limbic system. These are all working somewhat independently and differently, right? and it's a good thing. Most of the time, you don't have to think to breathe, right? You ever think about breathing and then you find you have a hard time breathing, right? Because we got a piece of our brain take care of it. You don't have to think about it. Dan Kahneman refers to it as systems 1 and 2 in his book Thinking, Fast and Slow, which is a good book. A lot of the stuff that was in here, Kahneman and Tversky were psychologists, believe it or not, who won the prize for economics, the Nobel Prize for economics, because a lot of what happens in economics is human behavior, and it's susceptible to all these things, these problems. Since then, I think one other psychologist has won the Nobel Prize in economics for what they call behavioral economics. That's one of the problems with classic economics is they assume that people will do everything they can to make as much money as they can to optimize their return on investment. But that's not what we do in real life. We got these strange things we do. And we do them predictably. That's where Ariely's book, Predictably Irrational, comes in. We have system 1 and 2. System 1 is fast. System 1 is where these biases are pretty much coded in. Because if we think about things enough, we could probably recognize these biases. That's system 2. The problem with system 2 is it's slow. It takes conscious effort, right? So you can think about it almost like conscious, unconscious. Simple. It's not that simple, but it's close enough. We have to think about it. And the problem is your brain, if you look at the amount of sugar, glucose, energy that your brain, everybody knows that it's huge. It's like 40% of any, of all the organs as far as taking energy. And anybody who's been in a class for a day, if you learn a bunch of new stuff, your brain's really working, you're really tired, aren't you? Right? This system 2, this attention that we pay to things, this what we consider this prefrontal cortex, the part that we think of as us, our thinking, is really, really slow. What they found is really we're more rationalizing beings than we are rational beings. And that's a tough thing for people to take. We want to think we're rational in what we do, but we're not really. We're making a lot of decisions in the system 1, but the problem with system 1 is it doesn't have language. So we're making decisions like this, and then our brain sometimes looks at the decisions we're making or the behavior that we have, and then it comes up with reasons why we did it because it has language. And I know this doesn't seem right, but it's what science keeps telling us, not just once or twice, but again and again and again, is we're making decisions at a level that is unconscious, and then we're making a conscious rationalization of the decisions that are made. That's not the way it should be. It should be the other way around. What else can we do? Well, once we get a better idea of how our operating system works by reading some books, and I got a whole bunch of books for you to read at the end. We need to cultivate and promote ideas of intellectual humility, intellectual curiosity. I went to Oakland PMI, and I gave a talk one time, and I said, well, I'll just show up and people are going to ask me questions. I said, no, you got to have something you're going to talk about. I don't know why, because I think people like to ask the questions. I think we have more fun that way. But anyway, so I said, okay, well, I'm going to tell you the two reasons that your Agile transformation will fail. And the 2 reasons that your Agile transformation will fail is lack of intellectual humility and lack of intellectual curiosity. What does that mean? One is, I already know, so I'm not going to listen to anybody else. That's the humility part. Curiosity is, I don't know, I don't care, right? That kind of thing. That's what's going to kill you. When I go into organizations, the key to agile transformation is changing the way we think. It's not just changing the way we behave. We have to understand why we're behaving in certain ways. And it's mostly, if you go through an agile transformation, what we're trying to do is let's change what the people on the front line do. That's not really where you're going to get your return on investment. We need to change what the people who have authority and responsibility do. Oops, I got my bullet points. I got my bullet points in the wrong order because I added another one. We need to understand the concept of cognitive dissonance. What's cognitive dissonance? Cognitive dissonance is let's assume that there's an objective reality that exists out there. And there's a reality that I've created in my mind. Cognitive distance is the distance between those two. How close am I to objective reality? Human beings are interesting this way because you would think that the further you are away from objective reality, your perception of reality and objective reality, right? You would think that people would try to fix that, bring it closer, but that's not what we do. In fact, we go the complete opposite. What we do is we try to change objective reality to match the fiction that we've created in our head. And this has been shown many, many times. I believe it was there was a sect called the Millerites. I could be wrong, but anyway, I think it's the Millerites. They predicted that the world was going to end on a certain day. So they all sold their possessions. They partied like it was 1999. They all showed up, went up on top of a hill. They did a Simpson episode of this, by the way. They went up on top of the hill and waited for the world to end. Now, I'm thinking, I think I'm a fairly rational human being. I'm thinking, okay, I got duped, right? I'm going to be pissed off. I'm going to tar and feather the person who told me the world was going to end. It's not what they did. One, the person who should have got tarred and feathered said, oh, I'm sorry, I was reading the tea leaves wrong. It's going to happen, 10 years from now or whatever. I just misread it, but it's happening. It's still coming. And did they quit the Millerites? Right? No, they didn't. They doubled down on it. They said, oh, it's going to happen. We just got it wrong. We just read the tea leaves wrong. They just believed it more. This is how human beings work. We would rather be right, feel right than be right. And it's a very strong thing. So it's cognitive dissonance. So it's strange that the further you are from objective reality, the further you become from objective reality. It's not self-correcting. We need to understand systems thinking, which is why I always talk about it, because you need to take these different lenses and different models, and you need to zoom in and zoom out and see the entire system and not just the isolated components. Very big. Understand scientific method and apply it. What does scientific method say? I say the superpower in the complex world is let's just assume we're wrong. I think that's what the scientific method, for lack of a better, that's a shorthand saying, look, let's assume we're wrong. Let's assume that this isn't true. And then if we can't prove that it's not true, then there's something there, right? But it can always be disproven. Science by nature you have to be able to disprove it. Have to. Because then it's no longer science, because that's what science is built on. Once you go from the standard that this is objectively true, and there's no way we could disprove it, like the white swan, black swan thing, then you're no longer in science. That's dogma. It's religion. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. Just know the difference between the two. When possible, this is what we said with systems thinking, pilot new ideas. Do things smaller, try some things, get out there and try something, see what happens, right? I'm not saying, I think life is, they always talk about, this concept of a target, and we're good at these visualizations. Let's say you got a target. We always assume like we got one arrow and we got to get right to this, as close to the center of the target as we can get. So we spend so much time thinking about it. We're gauging wind speed and muscle tension and all kinds of stuff. And we finally let the arrow go. I think life in the complex world is much different than that. I think we got a lot of arrows. And I'm not saying we just put a blindfold on and we just shoot wherever. I'm just saying that, you shoot kind of close to the center of the target. You shoot directionally towards the target, and then you say, hey, well, I didn't hit the target, but if I move to the right 2 inches, I'll get closer, right? I think that's the way the world really works. So do some smaller things where it's not this thing where I've got to put all my eggs in one basket, right? Where I've got to bet everything on this one go. Take some small bets and allow those small bets to teach you and correct yourself. I think it's a much better way. Understand the mental models and cultivate them. The Farnham Street blog has 109 mental models. It's pretty important. You should probably look at that, or somebody else who's written about mental models. Understand the true reason for diversity, which is diversity of thought, because we all have different experience. We all see the world differently. And together we can come closer to objective reality. This is the concept of crowdsourcing, by the way. I think it's what it's called. How that's happened is they did all the experts on weight, I guess on cow weight, they said, guess the weight of the cow. And no individual expert got the weight, but when they took the average of all the weights that people had, it was much closer to the actual weight of the cow. So they have things called crowdsourcing. So why? Because if you get a bunch of people's different opinions, they see the world slightly differently, you're going to come closer to reality. It's pretty interesting. Some people are better at forecasting the future than others. This is a real power. I'm not one of them, by the way. But there's a book called Super Forecasters, and I've got the link in here, which talks about this study that they did. They had people predict the future, and then they tried to figure out who was better at doing it. Because when they first did it, he came up, I forget who it is. His name will come to me in a second. One of the writers of it, but he has this quote of people who predicted the future were as good as dart throwing chimps. All these pundits that we have on TV, what do they say? They predict things. They try to be provocative, but they're not very accurate in their predictions because it's been studied. So what they did is they not only studied the people who were supposed experts, but they studied people who actually did predict the future better. It's called the Good Judgment Project. Phil Tetlock, I want to say. They studied the people who actually were able to predict the future better, and then they found that they had certain qualities. Find out what those were. Well, one of those things, one of the main qualities it had is that the people who predicted the future better, who were able to model reality better, were people who brought multiple lenses, multiple mental models to every problem. And they were willing to admit they were wrong is another part of it, because they were willing to change their predictions when they got more evidence, which is what you should do, but not what most of us do. We'll ignore evidence that's contrary to what we believe because we'd rather stick with what we believe than believe what is the right thing to believe. We need to understand the growth mindset. We need to understand, Carol, I think it's Carolyn Dweck was the person who wrote a book about the growth mindset, if I got her name right. Our minds are interesting, and they're what we would call plastic. With the brain plasticity, we thought that people, because they learn languages easier and stuff when they were younger, that your brain plasticity, kind of died off as you got older. I see some older folks here on the screen. It hasn't died off, right? Our brains are still as active if we want them to be. We can continue to grow. We can continue to learn. We can continue to contribute. We all know that. Some of the younger folks don't know it yet. We have revenge on them because guess what? They're going to get older too. We need to foster, if we're in leadership, wherever we are in the organization, we need to foster an environment where these things are encouraged. Things like, psychological safety, diversity, equity, inclusion. That's the new one. It used to be D&I, now it's DEI, which is fine. Sometimes we change the acronyms too fast for me. It's hard to keep up. DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. We need to create and support an environment of continual learning, both personal and professional, right? This is important. We can all learn. We should all learn. If you're in knowledge work, what is your tool? It's your brain. You should know how your brain works. You should feed your brain. And that includes, by the way, having conversations recently, that includes relaxation, off time, downtime, right? If you can't work your brain all the time, just like if you're a marathon runner, you don't run a marathon every day to train, right? You have to take some downtime. But we need to understand how our brain works, and we need to continually feed it. Your brain, to me, your brain is like a muscle. If you feed it, it gets stronger. If you feed it the right food, it gets even stronger. If you feed it junk food, which is what we have mostly these days, and I'm susceptible to junk food, both physical and mental, just like others. Read a book is what I'm saying. Don't expect everything off of Twitter, and I don't think everything off of videos. I think when we read books, I think that's cool. Slow down, take some time. And if you happen to want to read some books, I got a few suggestions for you. These are almost all the books that I have read. Not all of them, but most of them that have helped me to understand some of these things a little bit better. And I encourage you to do so. And so I will put the presentation up as I always do. So now you got a bunch of links that you can follow. Right? I wanted to finish with a quote from Sinclair because we're talking about these things in the workplace. It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. I don't know. It didn't fit, but I like it anyway, so I'm going to put it in there.